writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, promotion specialist for Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Laura, Kobo Writing Life's author engagement manager. Today we spoke to thriller author Catherine McKenzie. Catherine was born and raised in Montreal, Canada, a graduate of McGill in history and law. Catherine practiced law for 20 years before leaving the practice to write full-time. An avid runner, skier, and tennis player, she's the author of numerous bestsellers and the upcoming novel, Have You Seen Her?
Our conversation with Catherine was a lot of fun and very insightful. Catherine told us about her journey from being a full-time lawyer, transitioning to a full-time writer. She gave us some insight into her writing process and gave some advice on writing and plotting psychological thrillers. And then we really dug into the nitty-gritty details of Have You Seen Her, which Laura and I both really enjoyed reading. Catherine told us about how she came up with the idea. She told us about the setting. This book takes place in Yosemite National Park. And she talked to us about the structure and the different POVs throughout the novel. It was a really insightful conversation, and we really hope you enjoy. We are joined today by author Catherine McKenzie. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To kick things off, would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in Montreal, and I did many things in my life, I guess, but I practiced law for 20 years. I was a litigator, and then I'm also an author, which is why I'm on this podcast. And I started publishing in 2010. My first book came out in Canada. It was called Spin. And now 14 and 15 books later, I have 2 books coming out in the next couple of months.
Now, before we dig into the author side, I really want to talk to you a little bit about your journey from a practicing lawyer to a full-time author. On your Instagram, you call yourself a recovering lawyer. And I'm just so curious how you made the choice to go full-time into writing.
I mean, that was a long process. And, I say recovering because I think law is a cult. I was actually just saying this to a book club yesterday in a lot of ways. So, it sounds insane, but I fell backwards into writing. It wasn't the plan. I wasn't one of those people who's like, I'm going to write a book. And I started writing a novel just because I had an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. And I wrote it. And then I wrote another book. And when I'd written the second book, I sort of started the process of finding an agent, obviously to get published, but I didn't really think about it as a business or as a career. I don't know why. I just didn't go there in my mind. And it really only hit me when I was having a conversation with the marketing director at HarperCollins after I got my book deal. And I still remember that conversation. And it's funny because she's now my editor for my Katie Wicks books, which we'll talk about later. So a full circle moment. But, I spoke to her and she was like, well, you need to be on Goodreads and this and that. And I was like, Goodreads, what the hell is Goodreads? I have no idea. And she made me go on Twitter and I'm still there, 13 years later or whatever. So my first book came out in 2010, as I said, and I was a partner in a law firm. And I, for 10 years, published a book a year and practiced law, which sounds nuts. I understand. I don't have kids. I used to say the answer to how I did all that was robots, but with all this chat GP and AI, I don't know if that's the right answer anymore. But, when you're a litigator, you're living in other people's problems all the time. And there's a certain level of stress that comes with that. And after kind of doing everything that I wanted to do in law, I had been thinking about leaving before the pandemic happened. But one of the things that I was hesitating about was, am I going to be okay at home without colleagues? Am I going to drive myself insane? And then we were all forced to be at home. And I was okay. I was like, oh, look, I can go running every day. And, I can cook for myself. And wow, my stress level is way down. So I took the leap. And, I did that knowing that the book business there's a great word in French, aléatoire, very precarious and up and down. And you're only as successful as your last book sometimes. And so I had to be okay with even if I never publish again, though I had a book deal at the time, but even if I never publish again after this book deal, I have to be okay with stepping away from this other career. And I found that I was, and it was the right decision for me, putting aside whether I could or will. And, so far writing full time is working out, but it was the right time for me to go. So that's my long answer to your short question.
No, it's a great answer to a medium question. But one thing that I bring up on this podcast time and time again is the crossover between lawyers and writers, because we interview so many authors who are either still practicing lawyers or who were lawyers. And I always like to ask, do you have a theory as to why there is that crossover?
I do have a theory. I also know 3 doctors and writers. So it's a smaller population, but 2 of them are Canadian. Vincent Lam is a practicing doctor, and Dan Calla, who lives in Vancouver, also still a practicing doctor and publishes. So it's possible. My theory is thus. I mean, I think there's like 3 parts to my theory. So one, I think like lawyers in general are sort of type A personalities, motivated people who can get things done. So they want to write a book. They do write a book. They don't just talk about writing a book, which a lot of people do. As an author, people are always coming up to you like, oh, I'm going to write a book one day. I'm like, great, go ahead. Why are you telling me about it? But so I think that that's part of it. I think also, particularly on the litigation side, like writing or being a lawyer, being a litigator is storytelling. The facts are constrained and you're not supposed to make them up, but you are still telling a story, and any litigation, any legal proceeding begins with a recitation of the facts, which you have to shape in a compelling narrative. And then there's that writing component that comes in as well. And then the third thing that I think is less talked about, but again, lawyers, particularly in litigation, meet people under stress all the time. And so that's not how most of us meet. Like, we're not stressed today. We're just having a nice conversation, right? And maybe your dog's stressing you out or whatever. But, it's not, when people used to come to see me in my professional job, as a lawyer, like that was like the second worst day of their life. The worst day of their life was whatever happened that led them to have to come to see me, right? Getting served with legal proceedings or getting fired or whatever. And I never saw them in good circumstances, right? Like nobody comes to their lawyer's office like, hey, so happy to see you today, Catherine. And so you see what people are like under stress, and it really gives you an access to people's psyche and psychology and personalities in a way that normal life, I think, doesn't. And, I used to say that I was like my clients 50% their therapist and 50% their lawyer. And so I think that those 3 things are my theory about why there's so many. And I'm sure lots of people just say like lots of people just hate being lawyers. And so they're looking for an escape to do something else. But I actually liked being a lawyer for most of the time that I was a lawyer. So that's what I think.
Did you ever, I don't want to say like draw inspiration from your clients, but do you think that having that window into people's psyche during some of the worst days of their life helped create characters in your psychological thrillers?
For sure. So I definitely am not basing my characters on any clients that I had, and they're not me, despite, people always assume it's me, but I'm like, my life was not that interesting. I've written 15 books and like, I have not done any of these things. So, be that as it may. Speaking about this book, or my previous book, I never joined a cult. Like I was not on search and rescue in Yosemite. My sister was. So I think it does give you, and, I have spoken a lot in the past about this idea of write what you know. And I don't think it means what people usually think it means. People usually think it means write about yourself or write about your own experiences, but I don't think that's what that means. To me, it means take things that you've been through in your life and take the emotions and reactions that you experience in analogous situations and imbue your characters with that to make them realistic and to make their reactions realistic. So for sure, seeing what people are willing to do when their backs are up against the wall and how they behave and how their personalities change, and even other less obvious things, but like how people's memories are not, like people think that they have perfect recall of conversations. Most people do not. And if somebody has a different memory of a conversation that they were a party to, it's like, oh, that person's the liar. And it's like, well, you could both not be liars, and you're just remembering different things because that's how the brain works. And we all have different heuristics and things that are important to us. And so we latch on to separate facts. And, a story that I tell that is not a legal story, but my sister and I have both told the same story about our childhood over and over again, but only happened to one of us. There's a story about a first day in a French school and a kid in our class having to go to the bathroom and not being able to say it in French and then peeing their pants. Like, it's a terrible story from the 70s. This would never happen now. And, I'm like convinced it happened to me, and my sister's convinced it happened to her. My mom says it happened to me, but we both have the memory. So what's that about, right? Like memory is malleable, and, trials happen years after events, and they're in part a memory. They shouldn't be, but they are a bit a memory seeking exercise, So I think all of that definitely helps me in my writing for sure, or makes its way into my writing anyway.
Very interesting. Yeah, I definitely could see how memories could change over the years, especially when you're having to go to trial years afterwards, like you said, and then you're kind of just looking at your statement to kind of remember what happened and
or there might not even be a statement, but you're looking at letters you wrote or emails, or another example. My sister and I were on a trip in Costa Rica many years ago, and we had this very scary experience on an airplane. In my memory, I was in the front seat. She actually unearthed a picture the other day and sent it to me, and I was sitting next to her in the back seat. And it's like, we all agree about what happened in this airplane, but I have moved where I was sitting from next to my sister to up next to the pilot. Like, why did my brain do that? How has that become my version of the story? And I have the photographic, and even with the photographic evidence, I'm like, well, maybe I changed places afterwards. She's like, you're insane. No, you did not. So, it's just weird, right? Memory is it's not a recording.
That's so interesting. And since you've been writing full time, has it changed your writing speed, or I guess like your release schedule at all? Do you find yourself writing more than you were before?
I am writing more. It hasn't changed my release schedule because one book a year is sort of anything any publisher standard, wants from anybody. It has allowed me to write a book in another genre and have 2 books coming out this year. But in terms of how long it actually takes me to write a thriller, it's not really that much faster for a couple of reasons. I used to write only on the weekends, basically. And so I'd have the week to sort of think about what I was going to write. And then I'd sit down on the weekend and I'd do my words or my pages or whatever goal that I had. And when I started writing full time and I was writing every day, you can't write. Well, maybe somebody can, but I cannot write from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., which used to be my law hours, at the writing desk. It just doesn't work. Creativity, I don't think works like that. But also I ran out of story. I used to have those spaces to think. And so I had to build those spaces back into my process. So it's maybe a bit faster, but not in any really significant way. It's just given me time to work on other projects as opposed to just, and I put just in quotation marks, but just a book a year.
And how do you build in that space to kind of let stories percolate and ruminate?
Yeah. For years now, I've been writing my books, what I call in thirds. So I spend the most time on the first third because that's really where I'm developing the characters and the world and the tone and the voice. I know the big picture going in, but I don't know any of the details before I start. And so I'll write that third and then go back to the beginning and polish. And then I'll write the next third and then go back to the beginning and then write all the way to the end and then revise again. So in between those thirds, I'll leave breaks. And then I don't always, right now I'm on a tighter deadline, so I've been violating this rule, but I've been trying to not write on my thriller on the weekends at all, to also give me that space. And I would say probably 1 day a week, I'm doing marketing, paperwork, the business end of things. So it ends up being, more time at my desk on the book, but not significantly more time in a weird way. Work expands to fill the time, I find. So
You mentioned that you kind of start from the first third of the book. So when you're writing such a psychological thriller, do you kind of know where the plot twists are coming in ahead of time, or do you kind of do that as you go?
The big ones, yes. So I know the who, what I call the reporter questions: who, what, where, when, why, how, before I start. I think it's important in mysteries of any kind to know that, because otherwise there's so much rewriting that needs to be done if you haven't set that up from the beginning. And then I thought of it, some of the major twists, and twists are usually just secrets, right? They're secrets the characters are keeping. And so sort of okay, well, when am I going to drop this? When am I going to drop that? Some of it's mechanical. So the other thing about thirds is that books tend to follow a 3-act structure. And so there should be something that happens at the end of Act 1, which is the first third, and then Act 2, which is the second third, and then the wrap up. And so I'm looking to drop those secrets in or twists or reveals or major events at certain signposts. And then, but the finer details of like what's going to happen in each chapter and what is going to be revealed in any given chapter, that I really work out as I go along. And I would say I plot like a couple of chapters in advance. So when I'm writing whatever chapter I'm writing, I'm also thinking about, okay, like, and then what happens? And then I'll take notes and work like that. So it's really how I've written, trying to think, probably all of my thrillers, definitely all of my thrillers, starting with, I mean, I've always known every book what the end result was and what the twist was, but I think I got sort of more systematic about it when I moved from writing commercial fiction, women's fiction, into writing mysteries and thrillers, because I had learned from writing my first couple of novels that like literally just going by the seat of your pants is a problem. And I remember when I was writing my two first novels that were published, Spin and Arranged, originally I meant to switch. So it's told from a woman's perspective in the whole book. But my original plan for that book was halfway mark, was to switch into the male point of view. And I know how to do it now, but I couldn't figure out how to do it then. And so I didn't do it. And then in my book Spin, which is set in rehab, I had meant for them to leave rehab way sooner than they do in the book. And there was this whole other side adventure that they were going to go on. And I couldn't get them out of rehab. And it sounds insane, right? Like I'm in charge, but how do I get them out of here? They just need to go. And I still remember saying that like to myself, like they just need to leave, get out of there. And again, these are things I don't think I would struggle with in the same way now, because I think I've just spent so much more time thinking about structure and developing my process. And it doesn't mean that writing a novel isn't a struggle every time. It totally is every time. The blank page, the like, oh my God, what have I done to myself? Why am I doing this again? Every time.
Have you always been drawn to reading thrillers as well? Were there any authors that kind of inspired you to start the genre?
I grew up reading detective fiction more. So I was a very big reader growing up, and my parents are both big readers. And so there were lots of books in my house. And so I was reading Dick Francis and Nero Wolfe and Agatha Christie growing up. So, and that was probably the majority of what I read growing up. And I wrote a book that eventually got published as The Murder Game in between the two women's fiction books. So in between Arranged and Spin, I wrote this thing called The Murder Game, which was a book about 4 law students who plan a perfect murder. And then it's 10 years later and the murder's been committed. And I got the idea for that book when I was in law school. So before I was ever thinking about writing novels, I had an idea for a novel. And that book has an unreliable narrator. And I wrote it in 2007. And I had hired an outside editor to read it. And she was like, oh, unreliable narrator. No one is ever going to publish this book. I wanted to throw it across the room when I was finished with it. And I listened to her. I was like, well, wait a minute. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Agatha Christie, and she was basically like, you're no Agatha Christie. I mean, she didn't use those words exactly, but that was certainly the implication. And so I put that book in a drawer. And then Gone Girl came out.
I was just thinking about that. Like, then there was a bunch of huge books in a row that all had unreliable narrators, like Gone Girl, Girl on a Train. That was huge.
Yeah. But I wrote I think that was in the air that it was coming. And so I wrote that book before Gone Girl came out. And when Gone Girl came out, 2012, I think, right? So when that came out, I was like, going to kill somebody. So I was still writing women's fiction at the time, but when I transitioned and I wrote my first mystery with my book Smoke, and really I wrote a psychological mystery sort of before that with Hidden, it was in the air already. So I wouldn't say that anybody necessarily inspired me, though of course I read and I love Gone Girl and I read Girl on a Train and several of those other girl books at the beginning of the girl trend. But I think it just sort of gave me permission to do what I had tried to already do 10 years earlier, and my publisher at the time was very open to me switching genres. But I did always have a twist. Like every one of my books has a twist in them from the beginning, and even the rom-com that I have coming out. It's just the way my brain works, I think. So
do you have any advice for authors who have an idea for like a psychological thriller or a mystery, but are intimidated by the twisty, turny nature and having to plot that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to read in the genre and to know the genre and the mechanics of it. However that is, like, you don't have to necessarily take a class, but I used to sort of give myself classes. So when I read Gone Girl for the first time, for instance, I read it the first time as a reader, just enjoying the story. And then at the end, I went back to the first page and I was like, okay, how did she do this? And I started reading it as a writer. Okay, what is she doing here? And like, oh yeah, okay. And so I think you need to know what the conventions of any genre that you're writing in are. And then you need to find your own path and your own voice into that story. And I'm not saying like go read 50 thrillers or 50 suspense books, like that can be overwhelming. But I think it's helpful to read the best of any genre, like whatever's been the most successful or the best reviewed or whatever appeals to you in that. And I think also, like, why are you writing in any genre? Is it because it's a genre that appeals to you and the story is something that like won't leave you alone? Or is it just you're trying to follow market trends? And, I am really against doing the second. I think it's different, recognizing that, I stopped writing rom-coms because like there just wasn't a market for them anymore, but also because I wanted to move into more complex stories. But recognizing that like, the market is back for these things. And I've had a bunch of ideas for them over the years and just didn't have time to write them. That's one thing. But I think sort of looking at the market and being like, I'm going to identify this hole. And, I don't think that works. So, but I think you want to know what the conventions are and what are you bringing to the table that's original, different, whatever, And I think right now, what's important, there's so many books in that category that I think sometimes the twists are getting like completely outrageous and ridiculous. And my promise to myself and promise to my readers always has been that the solution is in the book. Like you might be surprised by the end, and I hope you are, but you're not going to be like, that's impossible. It's not some like outside thing that you were never told anything about. It's not twins. Then you never met the other twin, like it's that you've got to be, I think, fair to the reader and have planted those seeds throughout the book. So is that advice? I don't even know.
I really like that. The solution is in the book is like such a great way to look at it, because I have had experience with a story where it was a twin that you didn't meet until the series finale of a 7-season show. And I was so mad.
That sounds like cheating to me.
It really does.
Yeah. It's almost unfair to the reader because part of the fun of it is trying to figure out the mystery. And if there's something where there's zero clue, it's like, well, I don't even have a chance.
I agree. And I think there's a really good episode of Sherlock. I think maybe it's the second episode. So he's working with Watson and Watson keeps saying, well, maybe it's twins. And he's like, it's not twins. It's never twins, And I think that that's right. Like, and at the beginning of Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, a book that just came out, he's got sort of like the 10 rules for mysteries. And one of them also, I think in there is it can't be twins. Like if it's and I wrote a book with triplets, but you knew there were triplets from the beginning, so that's okay. But you can't have like the surprise twin or the surprise triplet come out of nowhere. Like that's my rules for writing these things, you have to figure it out. I think you have to be able to go back in the book and say like, oh, look, everything was here. Maybe I didn't understand it. Maybe I misread it. But everything is here. And if you have an unreliable narrator, everything they say, like they're withholding information, but everything they say has to be true. Like they can't say in their mind, I didn't do this when they did it, Like that's not fair. You're just tricking people. And then you didn't actually write a mystery. You just wrote a trick, which is different, I think, That's what I think.
I totally agree. And can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, which Rachel and I both just finished and really enjoyed? It's called Have You Seen Her? So we're dying to talk to you about it. So can you tell us a bit about it, but spoiler free?
Yeah, of course. So Have You Seen Her is about a woman named Cassie who is escaping something in New York. She's leaving her life behind in New York and going back to her home turf in Yosemite, California, to work on search and rescue team there. She had worked on search and rescue 10 years ago, and then she'd left after something terrible happened 10 years ago and went to start this new life. And now her old life is calling to her as she escapes her new life. That makes sense. And it was loosely inspired by the Gabby Petito disappearance. Was that 2 years ago, I guess now, which happened in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in a different national park. And my sister, as I mentioned briefly before, worked search and rescue, as did her husband, for 5 years in Yosemite. And I've long wanted to set a book in that setting, but I didn't have the story that I wanted to tell. And it was really interesting, when Gabby went missing, there was another couple, and who also went missing, 2 women, and were turned up dead. And they had all been at the same campground in Moab. And it was just like, this is so strange. Life is strange. And so this idea that and setting that had been percolating for a while was there. So a couple goes missing, and she gets involved in the search and rescue operation to find them. But of course, there's other things going on, which I will not spoil.
Like Laura said, we both had a blast reading this. And like I mentioned before we started recording, I was all caps texting her about the book this morning as I finished the final chapters. But I kind of want to talk to you about the setting. You mentioned that your sister worked search and rescue there. Did you have to interview her a lot to kind of get the ins and outs of the park? Did you do a lot of additional research?
I definitely asked her and my brother-in-law questions. They now live just outside of Yosemite in Mammoth, California. And so I've spent time there, and we went twice. I think I've been twice now into Yosemite, maybe 3 times. So I was able to do some of that. And yeah, I always, Google is your friend, as one of my other author friends told me, there's so much information out there. But ultimately, I think that there's a disclaimer in the acknowledgements, which is like, everything I got right, it's due to them, and anything I got wrong, whatever, it's for the story, So I think anytime you're in any setting where people know a lot, it's going in and taking out enough details so that it feels real without getting bogged down in that stuff. So, but it's interesting. I was there last summer, and I had written, because books, I've written them like the year before they come out, and I had turned the book in, and I was like, oh, there's some stuff I have wrong. Again, my memory had shifted about just certain layouts. And I had a map I'm in my office right now. I've taken it down, but I had a map on my wall for a long time of the various parts of the park. And I'm holding them up, but I still have my day hike maps and this National Geographic book, which I never actually read, but my research is still here, whether I read it or not.
And do you have any climbing experience? Because Cassie and one of the other characters do quite a bit of climbing in the book.
Yeah. So again, I have climbed a little bit, but I'm terrible and I'm afraid of heights. So my sister is a climber. And for that, actually, I watched a lot of climbing movies. So that was more, I watched every climbing documentary available on streaming, and there's quite a few of them. So the Free Solo, which I think is mentioned in the book, and lots of people have seen because it was won the Oscar, but the Dawn Wall, which is a great one, The Alpinist, which is a story about a Canadian who died tragically after doing all these incredible things, and probably 4 or 5 others. So I definitely sort of immerse myself in that climber culture. And like anything, it's also a cult, right? People go off and leave ordinary life behind and pursue these really, really dangerous things. and it creates a subculture, around it. And so I immerse myself. It was nice to have all those documentaries, because a way of visually immersing yourself in that subculture.
Now that you mentioned that climbing is a bit of a cult, I feel bad admitting that after reading the book, I now have a window open on my laptop right now to get my top rope belaying certification.
Fantastic.
So I'm about to join a cult, and I'm ready for it.
No, it's not a real cult. I'm kidding. And I climbed the Grand Teton in 2013, 2014. And I did all the ropes training and everything to do that. And so I have done an insanely scary climb myself. And I grew up hiking. My family was big backpacking, hiking, outdoor people. So that I did have that sort of outdoors experience for sure. But yeah, good. I just my feet cramp in those shoes. and I'm afraid of heights. So it's a very bad combo for me.
The shoes are not comfortable. If anybody out there is
really not
thinking about
comfortable.
climbing, they are really uncomfortable.
Yeah, they're like 2 sizes too small.
Yeah.
And my feet just cramp in normal shoes sometimes. So it's, yeah. Plus the fear of heights. Yeah.
As someone who also kind of has a fear of heights, I'm going to let Rachel be the climber in this podcast.
Yeah, no worries.
So, Rachel, you can take that on for both of us. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about the structure of the novel. So the story is told primarily through Cassie's POV, but you also have Jada's Instagram post, Petal's journal.
Yeah.
So how did you come up with the structure, and was it kind of challenging to figure out the proper balance between all of them?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to, it's funny, I like things go in cycles. So I'd written a bunch of books from multiple points of view, which I think really culminated in my book, I'll Never Tell, that has 7 narrators. And then I was like, I need to like go back to just trying to write a book from one person's point of view. So I did that in my book, You Can't Catch Me. And then 6 Weeks to Live was 4 narrators again. And then Please Join Us, I went back to 1. So I've sort of been going back and forth with that. And I wanted to get the other women's voices in the book. And I wanted to do that in a sort of more original way. And I think so much of people's lives is online, and that whole idea, which is not an original thought on my part, but I think is still an important subject, is the way we project and then what's really going on behind the scenes, because that's a lot of what this book is about. And so I had, I think, the idea for the Instagram posts pretty early and decided Jada, that's the whole way we're going to see her. And then Petal with the diary, it was just so fun to get into Petal's voice because she's very voicey, to use a writer's term, and to just be able to like write these things that are just so completely different than Cassie was fun. And the way I intersperse things like that is because there's also a time thing, right? There's chapters in the present and chapters in the past. So I work in Scrivener, and it allows you to color code things. And so it's kind of like music, it's literally like, oh, okay, I'm going to write approximately this many pages before I come back to the present, or this many chapters. And then there's a music to like when a Petal and Jada are going to come in. And then those posts, fade out later in the book as we actually meet them as people. So it's really like a visual thing, and it's an instinct thing that I've kind of learned again over just years of writing books of what that balance should be between the main narrative arc and these sort of side roads that you can go on. And I apply those same rules to backstory as well. This book doesn't have a lot of time in the past, but sometimes I have written books with lots of time in the past. And that's a balancing too. You want more of your story needs to be happening in the present to keep people interested and engaged and moving ahead. But I think probably the funnest part of writing this book were the Petal's diary entries. I was actually just rereading some of them yesterday because I got my final proofread, which is like pointing out, oh, you use the word most 7 times on this page, or whatever. And so a lot of those happen to happen in Petal's diary entries, I think. So I was looking at them again, and yeah, I'm proud of them. I think they're fun.
Yeah, it's kind of true what you said about how it really stays in the present, but I think it was a good choice for this novel, especially because as the reader, we kind of find out more about Cassie as everyone else in the novel finds out more about Cassie. So right. It was definitely interesting to learn more about her as the book went on. Something else you use in the narrative is blog posts. Mm-hmm. And we see this a lot in real life too, like with the Gabby Petito case, for example, where true crime stories are picked up to become like a new podcast, or they become really big on social media. Yeah. So how do you think that kind of the advent of social media has changed true crime and investigation? Because there's definitely mixed opinions about it.
Yeah. I mean, are those things actually solving the crime, or are they just like theorizing? I mean, it happened recently, I think, with what was it? There was something recently where someone was accusing, it was totally nuts. Like they were accusing somebody who was not responsible. Oh, the killing of those girls, in the college. And some true crime podcaster was like accusing one of the teachers of doing, it was completely bananas. So I think sometimes people are just going off half-cocked without thinking about libel or slander. And me as a lawyer, I'm like, whoa, 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 like slow your roll there. But I did want to explore that a little bit because, again, that is something that really part of why, beyond the fact that she was white and blonde, part of what happened with Gabby was that this online community really took up that case. And because she was part of the online community and, I'm trying to write like fun books that you can enjoy, but I do always want to have a little bit of a message in there. And one of the messages that came out of her case was like so much attention focused on this one girl when lots of women go missing, particularly women of color, and their cases don't get national media attention and aren't solved. And so I wanted that voice raising those questions to be there. And I thought that doing it in the form of a blogger who was making those very points was a good way of doing it, because the first couple that goes missing in my book is an interracial couple. And so, I wanted to sort of spotlight that issue a little bit through them. But it is also, I also want my stories to be anchored in the now. And that is part of what happens. If somebody goes missing, the media could pick it up and it can become this sort of national maelstrom that you get sucked into, or it could be crickets. You just don't know, So, do I think it's a good thing? Like, did you watch that documentary, Don't Fuck with Cats? They help solve a terrible thing that happened in Montreal, but I think there's lots of people, there's probably a whole books about people caught up in people theorizing who didn't do anything. So people probably need to be a bit more careful before they start flinging around accusations of like murder, But if more crimes get solved, then that's good, obviously. And I think in general, we're kind of bad at solving murders, not gang related murders, but sort of stone cold murders. Even if you look at the Murdaugh case, I don't know if you guys watched that documentary on Netflix, but I think that guy, would it have been solved? I think he solved the case for them ultimately, because he was like, oh, here's my alibi. It was like the third thing out of his mouth when he's talking to the cops. And then with the whole like attempted murder and all this stuff, it's like, we weren't looking at you, but we are now, And there was a case like that in Quebec too. A former judge of the Court of Appeal of Quebec was convicted of murdering his wife. And originally it seemed like a suicide. And I remember reading the judgment about it and was like, the cops were not suspicious of him until he said, oh, you're obviously looking at me, And so I think like sometimes you can bring attention to yourself in ways that you shouldn't. So do better, murderers. No, I'm kidding.
This is a great lesson in how to get away with murder.
Exactly.
I kind of want to stick with talking about the structure of the book for a second, because like you mentioned, the book kind of has two timelines, like now and then. Mm-hmm. Did you tackle the story in a linear fashion when you were writing it, or did you jump around during the writing process?
I always write chronologically to the book. So even if the book is not in chronological order, I still write the book chronologically as the way you, as a reader, experiences it. So hence my need for chronologies and writing programs to keep on top of that. But yeah, no, that's how I wrote those. And even I wrote one book that was like totally out of order, and that's what I did. That's how my brain works.
So when you're tackling the book, jumping around, do you always know the twists and turns? Like, did you know how this book was going to end? Did you have that final scene?
Yeah. Oh, well, the final scene, you know what? The book ended in a slightly different place than the final scene, which I will not give away. And one of my editors was like, you can do better than that. And I was like, I know, I just got tired at the end. You're right. I can do better. And so the solution was always the same, but the final chapter of the book came out during the editorial process. But I can't tell you what it is because...
No spoilers. People need to experience this wild ride that Laura and I went on.
I was texting Rachel last night, like, you need to get to the ending so we can talk about it. And then I got those messages this morning.
Funny.
Cassie is an extremely mysterious protagonist, like we mentioned. So the reader is kind of learning about who she is and her past as the novel progresses. How did you, when you were writing, ensure that you weren't giving away too much too soon or holding back too much?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a balance that you learn over time, I think. Again, I like to think about it as my characters have like a list of secrets. Like everybody has secrets. And I give my characters a list of secrets and it's like, okay, well, when are we going to learn about this secret? And what impact would it have on this story here if we learn about that secret? And then when's the next secret going to come out? And so that's how I always thought about it. And I think Cassie to me is a changeling, right? Like her way of dealing with things is just kind of running away and starting over. And I think she adopts sort of whatever personality / lifestyle goes along with whatever new location that she's in. And so it's interesting to write somebody like that. It gives you a lot of freedom because she kind of doesn't have a personality. I mean, she does, but her personality is shifting. And I don't think Cassie actually is an unreliable narrator. I don't think that's a spoiler, but she's just not necessarily interested in telling you what you might be interested in knowing, if that makes sense. Because she's very forward focused. Like she doesn't stop and ask herself a lot of questions, which, if she did, there wouldn't have been a book. She's just kind of all instinct, like need to go, go somewhere else. Okay, do this, show up here.
She was a lot of fun to read. And there were a couple of moments where she did reveal a secret and you're just like, wait, what? Hold on. It was a lot of fun.
Pardon? Yeah. And that's always the fun stuff to write too, right? Like, oh shit moments, as I call them.
Very fun to read too.
Thank you.
And I'm going to take like a hard left turn here.
Yeah.
Because we also want to talk to you a little bit about marketing, because you mentioned you set some time aside during your schedule to do some of the marketing. And we noticed you have a newsletter, you have socials, you have a TikTok, and we're just curious how you use these tools to kind of reach your readers and how they play into your marketing plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the lot of writers these days that your life is kind of online in certain ways. And I am actually a fairly private person. So there's lots of my life that I don't put online. I'm not private about my political opinions. If you want them, you can read my Twitter. But I mean, I've learned over the years that the things that people respond to the most on my social is stuff about my books. And so I don't want to only just be talking about that, but if I post other stuff, people kind of don't care. So everyone has their own online personality, right? And so I just try and do different things. I think, the nice thing about Instagram is people kind of create content for you. They take really nice pictures of your books and it's like, oh yeah, I can just regram this or whatever it's called now, and share this. And so that's nice. And I mean, TikTok, I don't even know what I'm doing on there, but whatever. Old lady TikTok, that's what I'm on. And I mean, I think the thing I'm probably most active on, honestly, is Twitter, though I've been less active recently. I'm on there. It's kind of a news source for me. But I think it's just a way of being accessible and also living in the now. That's just how people are now, right? People text, people email, people. I mean, I remember years ago, one of my early books, somebody was reading it and Facebook was in it. And they were like, "Are you sure you want to put Facebook in your book? Like that could date it." And I was like, I think Facebook's here to stay in some iteration or other, So it's not like people are going to read this 10 years from now and be like, Facebook, what the heck was that? Maybe MySpace. But yeah, I think these things have become ubiquitous. So I think that's just part of, like I said, I think it's part of being an author these days. But I wouldn't stress about it too much if somebody's thinking about breaking in. Like you don't have to have some huge Twitter following or Instagram following, or I had none of that and I got a book deal anyway, So just write a good book. Like if you enjoy social, do it. Don't do it if you don't enjoy it, because people can tell when you're faking and they don't respond to it. So I think there's enough different platforms that most people can probably find something that they're comfortable doing, whatever it is. And if you don't feel comfortable doing any of it, like it's fine.
And just to keep jumping topics here, because I know we have had a lot of your time already today, but we have so much we want to talk to you about. You also write rom-coms under the pen name Katie Wicks.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious how this process has been. And do you kind of enjoy the process of writing rom-coms as a break from the deep, dark world of psychological thrillers?
Yeah. And I mean, that was part of the reason why I wanted to do it is, these books can be dark. You're living in a dark place, writing about dark things, even though I think I write thrillers with a light touch. Like there's not a lot of blood and gore and fist fights and, or whatever. Right. But they are still darker stories. And it is nice to write something that's just fun and funny and light. And And so I had this idea for a book about a singing competition because they've been around forever. And I feel like I had never read a book set in a singing competition. And so it's called Hazel Fine Sings Along, and it's coming out May 2nd under Katie Wicks, my pen name for that book. And I have a second book coming out next year called Chloe Baker's Lost Date next April. And then, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, or maybe it was before we even started this, but I think I'm sort of fusing both things in my next project, which I just announced, which I can say what it is. But yeah. So sorry. So so I just sold a funny mystery series in a 3-book deal. And the first book is called Every Time I Go on Vacation, Someone Dies. And it's about an author who has a long-running mystery series where the detective is based on a real person, and she's very sick of that person. And she wants to kill him. In her book, of course, a literary murder, not an actual murder. And they're on tour together in Italy with a bunch of other mystery writers. And he thinks somebody's trying to kill him. And it goes from there. And it's a lot of fun. And it's fun. It's fun. There's romance, there's adventure, there's laughs. It's very voicey. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to be writing for the foreseeable future. And the first book comes out. I was just writing the second to last chapter this morning. It's coming out next summer. The first book is coming out next summer.
That sounds so fun. So I'm excited to read it. It sounds like it could be like a Netflix series or something. So someone
maybe,
we're putting it out there.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, it's in the vein of like Only Murders in the Building and Knives Out and See How They Run, Poker Face. And then in the book side, there's the Finlay Donovan books. There's the book that I mentioned earlier that I read after I sold my book, but Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, where that guy and I share like a brain. I need to meet him because it's fun. I have to meet him to be like, hey, you need to read my book, but I swear to you, I wrote that before I read your book, because we have some very similar things going on in our books in terms of tone and speaking to, like, breaking that sort of fourth wall and talking to the reader. So something was in the water, obviously. That happens. So yeah, I'm looking forward, and it's been fun. It's just like fun to write those books, which is nice. Writing should be fun, right?
I think so, which is why I don't do it a lot, because I struggle with it. But that's what I've heard. So you are releasing this thriller. You have some rom-coms coming out. You were working on this fun mystery series.
Yeah.
Any other ideas you have percolating? I know you have so much on the go.
I've written some films that are in development. So we'll see. Some original movies.
Interesting. I know we can't ask you more because you probably can't say, and you also don't want to put anything out there. It's so weird on the film side. It's like you really can't talk about it until it's set up. But I've written 3 original film scripts, and we'll see if any of them ever get made. Can I ask how it was process-wise switching from writing prose to writing screenplays?
I mean, I started writing screenplays a while ago and sort of put myself through screenwriting school to learn that. There's definitely mechanics of it that are different. I'd say I write dialogue heavy in my first drafts of my books, and scripts are obviously dialogue heavy. And so that was not such a hard transition for me. I think it's, again, just more learning the structure and the mechanics of scripts. You know, there's a whole different program that you need to write a script in. And so you need to learn how to work that thing. And how do you move people through space on a page? And there's just way less prose. And yeah, it's a different medium with a lot of the same skills. So it was a learning process, and I put myself through boot camp, and I'm still learning, just like I'm still learning on the book side too. You know, I think if you think you know everything, like, you should just stop, because you probably know nothing.
I feel like a lot of people could use that advice. But yes, I imagine learning final draft after working in Scrivener is it's a very different program.
Oh, completely different. Yeah. I mean, there are good parts and bad parts of both programs. Final draft has lots of shortcuts in it, which is nice. But the spell check is terrible. And there's no perfect writing program. Ideally, honestly, I would just write everything in Word, because it's probably the closest to being a perfect writing program, but it doesn't give you the same kind of visibility as some of these other things do. So, and I think I probably use the 10% of the capabilities of any of these programs. So I will say in my new book, I have footnotes, and it was fun getting to like use the footnote function again. It's like back in my law world, but I'm using them for fun.
Well, hopefully, fingers crossed, we will see your name on the screenwriter byline on a movie poster soon. And before we let you go and carry on with your Friday, where can listeners find you online?
My website is CatherineMcKenzie.com. That's Catherine with a C, M-C-K, no A. It's amazing how many different ways there are to spell my name. On Twitter, I am CE McKenzie1. And on Instagram and Facebook, I'm Catherine McKenzie author. And on TikTok, I'm Catherine McKenzie 4. There's 4 other Catherine McKenzies, apparently. Or 3 others. I haven't found them yet. I need to go looking for them. Who are they?
Well, we will make sure we link to all of those in our show notes so everyone can find you. And Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. This was so fun. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Catherine's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. Be sure to follow us on social media. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram.
This episode was hosted by Laura Granger and Rachel Wharton, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker. And huge thanks to Catherine McKenzie for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.